Good morning. Ms. Graham, would you please continue with the examination of Mr. Nicholson?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Nicholson.
Good morning.
Yesterday, as we reached the end of the day's proceedings, we were talking about police securing properties. Yes. And I had asked you about, as we looked at the minutes of the Gold Group meetings, there were 5 loci identified. And I was asking questions primarily about the 3 properties where there were householders. So Colette Bell's house, Martin Dick's house, and the family home of Saeed Saeed. If I can begin by just simply summarising my understanding of the position, I think as I understood what you said, the SIO's role would be to identify the properties that were to be secured, and to consider what justification there was for securing those properties. And you're nodding, which is good. And then we heard that there was a crime scene coordinator appointed and there were crime scene managers. And I think you said that one or other of them would be responsible for delivering an explanation to the police officers who would then go out and secure the properties.
That's correct.
And the explanation would be essentially why the property was being identified and was to be secured, what they were looking for, and to answer questions such as when the occupiers would get the property back, that type of thing.
Yes, that's correct.
And then the officers on the ground would go out to the properties and deal with the occupants, and they would know if there was a warrant. They would have been told about that. And if there wasn't a warrant, those officers would be responsible for seeking consent from the occupiers.
That's correct.
And they would have some discretion to provide information and deal with the occupants as they saw fit.
That's correct, yes.
Is that a reasonable summary
yes,
of
absolutely
where we were?
Yes.
Thank you. And as the proceedings drew to a close, I started to ask you questions about if there were conflicts or issues that arose. Were those brought to the Gold Group's attention? Yep. And I think you said it depends what the conflict is and what it's about. The Gold is more focused on the strategy and making sure that we deliver on that strategy. And as I said, we stabilise and make sure that we don't lose anything.
Yes, that's correct.
And I'm interested in exploring what you meant when you said we don't make sure we don't lose anything, just so that people can understand what you mean. We talked yesterday you talked about productions and you talked about evidence. And so when you say not lose anything, what was it you actually meant by that?
Well, we need to secure productions, as I said already, so it would depend on exactly what the SIO is looking for in terms of the house searches. So, an opportunity, and I'm not suggesting that's what's happening here, but an opportunity to destroy evidence, with a drug search, flush drugs down the toilet, all of that kind of thing. So it's just in all of these cases making sure that evidence isn't lost. So we, from a police service perspective, in this kind of incident, we're making sure that we can provide everything possible to the PIRC so that they can carry out their independent and effective inquiries. So productions that would be outside, and if it was raining or wind or whatever, then making sure that these productions are preserved, if you can, at the location that they're at, and if you believe that you can't, then to seize them, have them photographed hopefully, and then seize them and bring them back where they're safe.
And when you use the word productions, I'm right in saying that in a criminal trial, items as well as documents can become either labels or productions, but they're pieces of evidence that the Crown will rely on to perhaps prosecute someone in the future at a trial.
That's correct, yes.
And you're talking about evidence being destroyed, and that can be where it's lost. Could that also include things like clothing that is washed or
Yeah.
burned or destroyed in some other way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So if there's any confusion with people who are listening to your evidence, you weren't just simply talking about losing things, misplacing them.
No, no.
You were talking about them being lost to the prosecution at a later trial.
Yes, that's what I was talking about, yes.
Okay. And so effectively that means that that evidence would perhaps not be present at all at the future trial, or it would be rendered inadmissible in some way. There'd be some flaw or some issue that caused it not to be available to the prosecution later.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. We heard evidence from a DC Finch previously in the inquiry on day 38 in February of this year, and he said, I asked him about in a situation where the police don't have a search warrant or other lawful ground to carry out a search, such as the householder's consent, what would be the consequences if the police were to search a property regardless and seize the evidence? And his answer was, the likelihood is that the search and recovery of the evidence would be deemed inadmissible in later court proceedings. Does that sum up really what the problem is?
No, that's absolutely right, yes.
So the police need to have the authority, or the evidence, if they obtain any evidence, could become inadmissible later.
No, that's right. And if they're searching for one thing, for instance, and what happens quite regularly, they search for drugs and they find a firearm, they would need to then go and they would obviously hold it there, but they would then go to extend the warrant and they would go back to Crown Office in terms of the firearm.
And that could be highly significant to the prospects of any criminal trial in the future. You mentioned an example of drugs. If the drugs weren't available, it may make it very difficult for the Crown to prosecute someone.
There would probably no case.
Right. And we've heard other evidence that if consent is refused by an occupier or there's no warrant, you have to get a warrant. And the way of doing that, the procedure is that an officer contacts a procurator fiscal, speaks to the fiscal and prepares an application.
That's right.
And they then put it in front of a sheriff, and the sheriff will consider granting the warrant.
That's correct.
And
yes.
then the police have the warrant and they can use that to go and search the property.
That's correct, yes.
Do you know, or do you remember now, what an officer would require to persuade the fiscal to put an application before a sheriff and ultimately persuade the sheriff to grant a warrant?
Well, so all the information about the incident they're investigating, what they're likely to find, that they believe it's there, any information or intelligence that would suggest that it's there, and the details of the house, the property. And so it would, it would need to be persuasive evidence. It's to convince the fiscal in the first place and then to convince the sheriff thereafter. So as much detail as possible, and outlining why it's important in terms of the incident that's being dealt with.
And if I suggested that they'd need to persuade the fiscal and then the sheriff there were reasonable grounds for suspecting a criminal offence had been committed and evidence would be found at the place named in the warrant, does that sound like a reasonable
Yes,
description of what's required?
That's correct.
Thank you. Is it possible for an officer to seek a retrospective warrant, so to carry out a search and then think, oh, we better get authority, I'm going to go and ask the fiscal now for a search I've already carried out?
I'm not sure what kind of reception they might get in terms of that, but it would be entirely possible, and it might be a route of trying to mitigate the damage that's been done. But I'm not sure it would be granted.
Do you think you'd get that past the fiscal?
I don't think so.
Right. Have you ever come across a situation where that's been attempted?
No, I can't
or
think. It
succeeded?
I don't think it would have succeeded, but it might have been attempted. But I suppose that someone realising that they've made a mistake, and then to try and mitigate that mistake and put their hands up to what's happened. Well, they could attempt or try to persuade, but it seems unlikely that would be successful.
Right. So not an approach that you would recommend? Let's put
No,
that way.
it would be better to apply for the warrant and then execute the warrant in the proper format, and the likelihood of success would be much higher.
And the proper format is apply in advance before you do the search.
Exactly.
Can I move on to some evidence we've heard about the three properties, Colette Bell, Martindick and the home of Saeed Saeed? We heard from Gary McEwen in evidence on the 30th of August about this issue about authority. And he said to go for a warrant, you have to stipulate on the warrant predominantly what it is you're going there for, what purpose. At that early stage, so at the early stage in matters, the 3rd of May we were talking about, I'm not sure that level of information and detail would be known. And he then agreed that officers may not have been in a position to secure a warrant because they wouldn't have all the details. And they were very much dependent on consent being given by householders. Yeah. From your recollection of events on the 3rd of May 2015, does that accord with your...
Yes, I think that's right, yes.
So the police were very much dependent on consent?
They were.
Right. And we heard also from Pat Campbell in evidence about Colette Bell's house. And this was on day 47, the 9th of March this year. And I asked him if he personally had carried out any checks in relation to the properties to ensure that the correct authority was in place, whether a consent or a warrant. And this is for Colette Bell's house. And he said no, that he would be delegating various responsibilities to individuals. He named Stuart Houston. And he said, I knew that what he would put in place would be sufficient to basically account for the search by consent. And if there were any issues, he would have made me aware of them as such. So I wasn't particularly aware in drilling down into the detail effectively.
Yep.
And he said, in relation to Mr. Stuart Houston, he would have deployed crime scene managers to all the different locations who would have engaged with the householders around what we were planning to do about the return of the property, how long it was likely to take, and so on. And he said if there was any feedback coming, or there were any issues with any of the consent that was given or implied. So he would expect feedback from Stuart Houston if there were any issues about getting consent.
Yeah.
Now, does that description of Pat Campbell's role in proceedings sound like a reasonable explanation?
Yes, absolutely. So we train the crime scene coordinator and the crime scene managers in terms of their role. So the expectation is that they would go and get on with what they're trained to do.
And so it's reasonable for the SIO to delegate responsibility and assume that will be carried out properly.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as I said, in terms of the strategic role, my strategic role, I can't look at every aspect of what's going on. There's too much to be done in terms of that, and it'll be the same in his role. He's got a wide role with a number of different issues ongoing, so it would be very difficult for him to dip down and check that absolutely everything is in place. At some stage he will learn, I've no doubt, get feedback in terms of what happened, and but at that stage it's reasonable to think that he delegates down and that the crime scene coordinator and the crime scene managers get on with their job and their work.
And the feedback could be, we can't get consent, we'll need to get a warrant.
That's correct.
And there'll need to be an application made, and that can be discussed at that point.
That's correct, yes.
And I think yesterday you said in that situation the police would remain at the property and then try and secure the warrant.
That's correct, yes.
And then we also heard from Pat Campbell about Martin Dick's house, and we heard evidence from him where he said there was no indication from any of the householders that there was any conflict with consent to search the properties. There was nothing to indicate they weren't consenting. And I asked him if he was satisfied that the officers had obtained consent for a search of Martin Dick's house when Martin Dick and his partner were removed from the house. And he said yes. He said he mentioned the forensic strategy meeting. The officers who dealt with Martin Dick were not present at that forensic strategy meeting, but the information is coming second-hand, and that was from Colin Robson and Stuart Houston. And they're feeding into the forensic strategy meeting, which I'm chairing. So the information I'm getting is that consent has been agreed for all the properties to search. And again, is it reasonable for someone in Pat Campbell's situation as SIO to rely on the feedback coming to him through Stuart Houston, the crime scene coordinator, and perhaps D.I. Robson?
Yes, absolutely. That's how we should get the feedback.
Right. And would that be the normal sort of procedure that's adopted in these situations?
It would be, yes.
And then again, finally, we heard from Pat Campbell on the securing of Zaid Saheed's family home. This is on the 10th of March. And he again said that he understood that that house was seized on the basis of consent, and it was consent that gave him the authority to have the search carried out on the property. So again, it appears in relation to all of those properties that consent was the basis.
Yes.
And did you hear anything to suggest that that wasn't the position in the Gold Court?
Not that I recall.
We haven't heard from Stuart Houston, but we do have an assigned inquiry statement from Stuart Houston, the crime scene coordinator. He says he arrived in Kirkcaldy after midday, and there was a briefing at about 12:30 that day. And then he speaks about attending, speaking to SPA Forensic Services at about 1:30, and then having the forensic strategy meeting after 4. So he wasn't at Kirkcaldy first thing in the morning, he came in the afternoon. He's given the inquiry statement in relation to Martin Dick and Colette Bell's house. I wonder if we can have his inquiry statement on the screen, because I'd like to refer you to some of his evidence. SBPI 00214. You'll see this is a statement taken by from DCI Stuart Houston last year, and if we go down to paragraphs 249, and I'll deal with a few of the. What I'll do is I'll go through these paragraphs with you, okay, and then I'll ask you some questions at the end. Problem. If we start with 249. So this is Stuart Houston, crime scene coordinator. My understanding of this address, this is a passage in his inquiry statement that relates to Martin Dick and also Colette Bell's house. My understanding of this address is that the deceased was at these addresses, so it's about preserving them. The legal basis is that they are scenes that may be linked to his death. As far as I was aware, there were no warrants at the location, but you'd protect the loci in order to get warrants further down the line. We're within our rights to do this. And if we carry on, you would need to ask people to move. It's quite common that we do as police. You don't know what's there until you search it. The deceased had been there prior to his death, and that's the reason for searching. I'm not sure if the occupiers were asked to move. That was done before my involvement. I was made aware that police officers were present at each location. 251. The fact is that we're not going to get them on the 3rd of May. My thought process was, as long as they're preserved, I don't need to go there at this time. I'm making a guess, but I think they were secured by uniformed police, so you can seize anything that's relevant to an investigation. To be blunt, because they're protected by police, I maybe didn't give those loci the attention they needed at the time. That's prioritisation and doing the things that need to get done. And then at 252. I can't speak to what happened before I was there. My interpretation is if you've got something that might be subject to an investigation, you'd tell me and ask them to leave and examine it as a consensual crime scene. So I think he's referencing consent there. Or take a warrant. That would be from the people who were there. I know the one something happened at that address. The something one I'm not too sure about. We have redactions on the screen because the individual addresses are actually redacted because of data protection.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you they're Martin, Dick and Colette Bell's houses.
Okay.
So this is what he's referring to at that time. And when we look back at paragraph 250, and he says, I'm not sure if the occupiers were asked to move. That was done before my involvement. You'll see that on the screen now.
Yeah.
He did not, as I said earlier, he did not arrive until the afternoon. So although he was appointed as crime scene coordinator, it wasn't until later on that day. And then 254, please. He says, my understanding is the searches were done long after I was done. I've no detail of anybody searching those houses in the time I was involved. I don't know what was found in the searches. So again, he's come in the afternoon, appointed as coordinator, but he was not aware of searches being done until long after he's left Kirkcaldy. So that seems to be the sum total of his involvement as coordinator. And then can I ask you to look at paragraph 258? And this, you'll see at the top, this says Zaid Saheed's address. That's the family home for Zaid Saheed. He says, you're not needing the whole house as such. It's not the whole house that needs to be secured. It's focused to what's relevant. You're only going to get the clothing and the car, and that was it. I don't think the house was seized as a locus. I don't think that house was ever actually secured for a period of time. That was my understanding of what was going to happen. Officers took possession of the vehicle. So in Stuart Houston's recollection, the only objects they were really interested in relation to the family home of Zaid Saheed was clothing and the car. So he doesn't seem to think the whole house needed to be secured. And then finally, 266. I have been told the occupier's position is that no permission was given for the police to secure the property and that a complaint was made. Again, this follows on in relation to the home of Zaid Saheed's family. I wasn't aware of this. I would dispute that they said they didn't give permission. If we didn't have permission, then we'd stay there until we had a warrant. So he seems to be of the same view as you, that if there's no permission, you have to seek a warrant, and the police remain there until that's obtained.
I agree, yes.
But as crime scene coordinator, he doesn't seem to understand or have been told that no permission was given to secure Zaid Saheed's property and that consent wasn't given. Now, reading that, does that concern you?
Yes, it does.
And why does that concern you?
Well, there's obviously a different view on whether permission was given or not, according to Stuart's statement. So we should be quite clear that we've got consent, and if we don't have consent, then we ought to get a warrant. And there seems to be confusion in terms of what Stuart's understanding is of what was going on. But
sorry.
Yeah, but I suppose my question is, what was he actually coordinating at that stage? Because it seems to be that he's arrived, and he says, I think, if I understood it correctly, that the searches were carried out long after he was gone. So, so he obviously wasn't coordinating the searches.
And if we go back to Colette Bell and Martin Dick's houses, I read those paragraphs to you earlier. That was from 249 down to 252. At 250, he says he isn't sure if the occupiers were asked to move. That was done before my involvement. So it would appear that if consent was obtained from Colette Bell or Martin Dick, this was before the coordinator was actually involved.
Well, that's entirely possible.
And what do you think about that then? Who was coordinating and managing things if Stuart Houston wasn't in Kirkcaldy at the time?
Well, the crime scene managers were always, well, the truth is I don't know. We've got Stuart's statement, but you know, we need some more detail around about that. But the crime scene managers themselves, again, I don't know when they were deployed. So you know, these are questions that Pat Campbell and his deputy could or ought to be able to answer in terms of the whole coordination of exactly what's going on and how the inquiry was progressing. When the crime scene managers were available, when the crime scene coordinator, what was the expectation of the crime scene coordinator when he arrived and before he left.
So we heard earlier that Pat Campbell was delegating things and leaving the detail of getting consent or a warrant to the crime scene coordinator. If the crime scene coordinator didn't arrive till after the properties have been seized, what would you consider that his ongoing responsibilities were in relation to the coordination of the crime scenes?
Yeah, well, so just exactly that is coordinating the 5 scenes. If the consent's already been, or they've already got consent in terms of the searches, the seizure of the properties, then he would be there to collate all the information, to understand what was being seized, to ensure that it was seized in a proper fashion, and then it was brought to, you know, wherever they were going to bring all the property to record when it was seized, what it was, and production management. So that would be my expectation of a crime scene coordinator.
So when Pat Campbell takes the decision to appoint a crime scene coordinator, what should he continue to do? Is there supposed to be a handover with the crime scene coordinator or some sort of briefing?
Yes, so the crime scene coordinator ought to be briefed so he understands exactly what's going on, why the houses are being searched, and what the expectation is of him in his role. So he would either get briefed by Pat Campbell or Pat Campbell's, more likely Pat Campbell's deputy, so that he could undertake the work that is expected of him.
And is it at that briefing that he should be given a full explanation of whether the house has been seized, whether a search has commenced?
Yes. What
the authority was for doing that?
Yes. So
is he given the explanation about the full justification?
He should be. You know, if he's going to undertake his role in a proper fashion, then he's got to know and understand all the detail. He's got to know and understand exactly what's expected of him. He's got to know and understand what's actually happening at each of the loci. So, but that would have to come from a briefing. Now that might be face to face, or it might be by phone, but he would have to be properly briefed before he could undertake his role.
Can I ask you what you make of the comment in paragraph 251?
Mm-hmm.
I think they were secured by uniformed police. We're still on Colette Bell and Martin Dick's house. So you can seize anything that's relevant to an investigation. To be blunt, because they're protected by police, I maybe didn't give those loci the attention they needed at the time. What do you make of that comment?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask Stuart Houston, but he obviously had questions in his mind, but he's saying that he didn't give it the attention that it needed or he says he maybe didn't give it the attention that it needed that time. But I can't speculate on exactly what he means by that.
Can we look again at paragraph 252? I can't speak to what happened before I was there. Is that the sort of comment you'd expect somebody who was properly briefed to be making?
Well, it depends what he means by that comment. So does he mean that, he can't give evidence about what happened or what people did, that is somebody else to give evidence in terms of what he did. But, was he given a briefing? And did he understand what had unfolded prior to him arriving there? But so I don't know what that comment means. It could mean a lot of things.
He says, my interpretation is if you've got something that might be subject to an investigation, you'd tell them and ask them to leave and examine it as a consensual crime scene. What about that description of obtaining consent to tell people, ask them to leave and examine a crime scene?
Well, so it's pretty clumsy, but I assume what he's suggesting and what he's saying is that it would, consensual crime scene, that it would be with consent that you would carry out that examination. So,
right. I'd like to ask you about crime scene managers. I mean, was this something that was discussed at the Gold Group meeting at all?
And I don't recollect that, and I don't think it would be in any detail anyway.
Right. I mean, Houston, we saw yesterday Houston was named as a coordinator.
Yeah.
Is that really the sort of level that you would get information about in the Gold Group?
Yes, mostly.
Again, from the statement from DCI Houston, we know that he didn't go to the loci himself.
Yes.
He would expect feedback from the crime scene managers.
Yes.
And I think that accords with what you've told us. He said that the crime scene managers were all DCs, detective constables. And we've been in the inquiry trying to see who exactly was the crime scene manager for each location. So if we start with Colette Bell's house, we've looked at the scene entry log, and it appears it was a DC Stanford who is listed as assisting the crime scene manager, but there's no crime scene manager named in the paperwork in the crime scene log.
Right.
I should say, DCI Houston doesn't name any of the crime scene managers in his statement. So he doesn't name them in his statement, and we've looked at the scene entry log for Colette Bell's house. And although we can find the name DC Stanford, there isn't a crime scene manager named.
Yeah.
Would you expect the crime scene manager to be named in a scene entry log?
Well, it depends whether the crime scene manager went into the scene or not.
Right.
And I don't know whether they did or not, but it sounds like if they're not on the scene entry log, then that they didn't. But so if they are managing, what's happening, they could manage that externally from the scene itself, depending on what the scene is.
So it can be managed remotely by the crime scene manager?
Yes.
Not actually being present?
Not being within the location.
We've also looked at Houston's daybook, and we can't see any names of a crime scene manager for Colette Bell's house. Is there anywhere else that you could suggest to us that we might be able to find paperwork that lists the name of the crime scene manager?
There should be statements from the crime scene managers, I would have thought.
Right. And in relation to Martin Dick's house, again, we've looked at the scene entry log, and DC Finch, who I mentioned his evidence previously, he was named as locus protection, but he did sign as crime scene manager in that section. So do you think, and Houston said crime scene managers were DCs,
Yes.
so do you think it was probably DC Finch that was the crime scene manager?
It sounds like it might be, but I honestly don't know that. I just wouldn't know that level of detail.
All right. And again, just for completion, in the family home of Saeed Saheed, DC Finch was also there for locus protection, but I think did sign as a crime scene manager. So he may have been the crime scene manager for both of those properties. Is that sort of paper trail what you would expect, given the significance of consent
Yes.
to the seizing, securing, searching of these 3 properties? Is that the sort of paperwork that you would expect to be available in relation to who the crime scene managers were and whether consent was obtained from the householders?
I would certainly expect there to be paperwork that would demonstrate who the crime scene managers were, and it should be straightforward to find out who they are. We should know who was on duty on that day, and from that understand who the crime scene managers were. I'm afraid I'm retired 7 years, so I have no access to any systems. There are probably police officers in this room that could help that, but so there ought to be paperwork that demonstrates quite clearly what role each person had.
We'll keep looking. So
Sorry about
the Gold Group were not aware of the details.
No, not at all.
Pat Campbell, it would appear from his evidence, delegated and didn't know about the details.
Yes.
Stuart Houston, it would appear, didn't really know about the details in relation to consent and what happened before he arrived. There doesn't seem to be this clear paper trail. Do you have concerns about the basis on which the police secured and seized properties that day? And I'm thinking primarily about Colette Bell, Martin Dick, and the home of Saeed Saeed.
Well, retrospectively, you would want to know that it had been carried out in the appropriate fashion. So either that consent was obtained or that there was a warrant. And we know that there weren't any warrants. So presumably everybody that's involved in the searches believed that they were carrying that out on a consensual basis. How they got that consent, I don't know. And we heard yesterday about whether it was best practice. One of the officers said that he noted it in his notebook, and of course that would be best practice. But that wouldn't happen on every occasion. But as long as there is consent, that the person's been spoken to, and both parties understand there's been consent, then from my perspective that's absolutely fine. It'll be for the officer to support that in terms of any evidence that's given.
And so, in light of everything we've discussed today, where does responsibility lie ultimately for ensuring that consent was obtained for Colette Bell's house, Martin Dick's house, and the family home of Saeed Saheed to be secured, seized, entered and searched?
So initially the responsibility would be with the people who went to search the property, and for them to get consent for what it is that they're actually trying to achieve. And as well, in the main, the understanding will be that that's exactly what's been done. If that's not what's been done, then fairly obviously there would need to be an intervention into that. But as I understand the evidence that's been given, everybody believes, and obviously, Stuart Houston's still to give evidence, but it looks like at paragraph 252 that he believes that it's on a consensual basis that the scenes are being examined. So.
I'll come on to this, but where we've heard evidence that consent was not given by certain occupiers, but all the police officers believe consent is the basis on which they're proceeding.
Yep.
In a situation where there can be miscommunication,
Yes.
the extent to which that may or may not be the position here is a matter for the chair. But if there is a situation which arises where there's misunderstanding or miscommunication between the occupiers and the police, can you help the chair identify how this could be avoided in the future? What could be done to improve the situation and to avoid these misunderstandings or miscommunication? Well,
we could insist on officers recording in notebooks that consent has been given, and there could be feedback, or we could insist that there's feedback from the officers on the ground to the crime scene manager through to the crime scene coordinator. We could insist that it's recorded that there's consent been given for each property.
So have that sort of direct feedback to the next
It's
in
a
line.
a formal system to record that consent has actually been given.
Thank you. In relation to, let's start with the evidence from Colette Bell that we heard in relation to her house. I'm going to give you a summary of what she said and ask you to comment on it. This was given on the 9th of February this year on day 40 of the hearing. And I asked her if she understood that the police were going to seize her house, and she said no. But she said, I think it was just said to us that it was the beginning of a crime scene. And I asked if she understood her house would be searched, and she said no. And I asked if she was given an explanation that the house would be searched, and she said she didn't think so, and she didn't. I asked her if she was asked for permission or consent, and she said no. But she did say, this looks like the beginning of a crime scene. That's what she was told. And we'll need to take hold of the house, so you'll need to pack a bag. That description, as it's been given by Colette Bell, does that match your expectations in terms of how you obtain consent from someone?
No.
Why not?
Well, it doesn't sound like it's consensual. So they would have to be pretty clear in terms of what's understood by the consent being given. So the person would have to be told that that's what the intention was, why that was, and then ask for consent to be given for, and explain why that's important, but and then obtain that consent.
And a suggestion we'd heard previously and we discussed yesterday, letting people know that they can withdraw consent. Would that be part of the process of obtaining consent?
Well, that isn't something that I've considered, but of course, you could include that in future guidance to make sure that people knew and understood that they could withdraw that consent.
Thank you. And then in relation to evidence we've heard regarding Martin Dick's house, we heard this from DC Finch. And I asked whether he understood that the householders had consented not only to the seizure of their house or securing their house, but for it to be searched for evidence relevant to the investigation into Mr. Byles' death. And he said, yes, that was his understanding. Now, we've heard evidence that as part of a search that was carried out at Martin Dick's house, that herbal material was discovered, and that DC Finch gave evidence that he phoned a DS Moore or a DI Wilson, and he was advised to phone the on-call fiscal to seek a drugs search warrant.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him about this when he was giving evidence, and he said, I can't recall why we needed the search warrant in addition to the consent. So he thought he had consent to search the property.
Yeah.
But when he phoned up, having found, or someone else had found the herbal material, he was advised to get a warrant. Can you explain why that would be done if there is consent?
Well, so the consent wouldn't be to search for drugs. So the consent was to search in terms of the incident that's being dealt with at the time. So they go in, they find something that's unrelated to what they've already got consent for. So the sensible approach is that you approach the fiscal, you explain the detail, and the fiscal will either agree to present the detail to a sheriff and ask for a warrant for the property to seize the herbal material.
And in these particular circumstances, he had sought advice from a senior officer.
Yeah.
He wasn't sure exactly who it was, but it was a more senior in rank officer from him. And is that the type of behaviour you'd expect from a DC on the ground?
That's exactly what you would expect.
And then looking at other evidence we've heard, evidence from a PC Fraser, and this relates to the family home of Zaid Saheed. He gave this on day 62, 28th of August, and he told us that he'd attended with a PC Aitken as locus protection on Zaid Saheed's family home, and he was the one that had maintained the scene entry log. And I asked him to explain how he went about obtaining consent. And he said, yes, I would knock on the door and introduce myself, and if I was allowed entry, then I would go in. And I would just ask questions, speak to them and ask them, who are you, and can you give me your name, address, date of birth, that sort of thing. And he would talk to them. I asked him about obtaining consent, and he said that it would all be verbal, as he called it, and he would not necessarily have written anything down in his notebook. And he didn't on this occasion write anything down in his notebook. He didn't get any signatures. So I asked him about where there was no written consent, did he think there was some other consent? He said, I believe I must have been afforded entry into the house. I didn't note any of the details of the people, but in order to speak to the people within, I can only assume. I don't recall, but I can only assume I knocked on the door and the door was opened. And I asked him if he considered the opening of a door was sufficient to be a recognition of consent. And he said no, the person must, they can, there's numerous ways. They can verbally say it, or they can just motion or walk away and leave the door open. And I said, is that like an open invitation, if you like? And he said, yes. And I asked if on that day anyone had given him consent to go into the house. He said, I don't remember. And then he had asked for support, and CID came. And that was the second occasion he went into the house. And if I said, do you remember if anyone gave you consent at that time? On the second occasion, he said, no, I don't remember. So that, from that description, do you think that's sufficient to assume that the householder is giving consent to seize the property, secure the property and search the property?
No, as I said already, you would need to explain exactly what it was that you were wanting to do and ask the occupier for consent.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to other evidence we have. This is from a witness who's given us a signed statement, inquiry statement. His name is Miller. We've not heard any oral evidence from him at this stage, but this comes from his statement. He was one of the CID officers who came to assist PC Fraser. We chapped the door, and I can't remember if it was Mrs. Rashid or there was an officer that initially let us in from the inside, but we were invited in, and Mrs. Rashid spoke to us. She's one of the occupiers. Immediately she started asking us questions, what was going on, all the rest of it. We tried to explain what was happening and the need to take the property. She was wondering why we were allowed in without a warrant, so we tried to explain that to her, that yes, sometimes you do need warrants, but on this occasion, because it was a serious incident that happened at that time, the property had been seized, as we've got to protect the forensic integrity of it. Now his recollection appears to be that Mrs. Rashid, the occupier, was asking for a warrant.
Yeah.
And he said that he explained to her that sometimes you need warrants, but on this occasion it was a serious incident that happened, and they'd got to protect the forensic integrity of the property. What's your view on that description of obtaining consent from an occupier?
Well, obviously he hasn't obtained consent, but the situation there is that when he's confronted with that, he ought to then think about getting a warrant.
And that would be following the procedure we described
Yes, absolutely.
earlier. Mrs. Rashid gave evidence, and in her inquiry statement in paragraph 3 said, describes the officer coming to the door. I opened the door and he told me we needed to vacate the property. I told him we wouldn't unless they had a warrant. He was very abrupt and quite rude and said they didn't need a warrant to come into the house. And presumably your answer to your comments on that would be exactly the same.
They are.
And then also in his inquiry statement at paragraphs 99 and 100, Miller said, I'm asked what was my understanding when I went to Zaid Sahid's home address of what our authority was for seizing the property. My understanding was that the decision had been made by the SIO that it has to be seized. Is that sufficient to obtain consent?
No.
And he then went on to say, a decision had been made at a senior level that this was a place of interest and that was the reason we were seizing the property. If there was a need for a warrant, it would have been obtained retrospectively. Given what you said earlier, what do you think the prospects of obtaining a warrant retrospectively were?
None.
Thank you. Now, to go back to something you said at the close yesterday, close of business yesterday, I asked you for an example when we were talking about warrants and consents, and that was in regard to conflicts arising, issues arising, disputes arising with householders. And I asked, could you think of any examples where you as a gold group would expect to have conflicts or issues brought to your attention? And at close yesterday, it was late in the day and you couldn't think of any examples.
Yep.
At this moment. Can you think of any examples today of where you as the Gold Group and you as Gold Commander would have expected to have matters raised and brought to your attention?
Well, anything. I can't think of an example at this moment, but anything that was significant in terms of conflict, then, or support, then that ought to be brought up the chain of command. If it can be resolved, or if it can be resolved by the deputy SIO or by the SIO, but if it can't, then it ought to be escalated up to Gold to have the situation resolved. So I can't really provide a good example at this moment in time, but I'm sure there will be.
Is anything I've described in the circumstances we've discussed today about warrants and consents the type of information that you think would have benefited the Gold Group to hear about?
Well, it sounds like at ground level they were getting on with undertaking their duty in the way that they thought was best. So it feels like a lot of that wouldn't have been escalated up to Gold at that time. Of course, Gold may well become aware of some of the issues at a later stage, but I can't recall becoming aware of any of the issues that you've outlined in terms of consent at any stage. But
I'm just wondering whether, looking back now, you think it would have been helpful for Gold to have had these matters brought to their attention?
Well, if they had been brought to my attention, then I would have done something to resolve them.
What would that have been?
Well, if it's about obtaining a warrant, then it would be instructing someone to contact a fiscal, and there's already a fiscal involved in this who knows the details, so it would be a case of going to that individual, explaining the circumstances, what was required, why it was required, and asking if a warrant could be craved, and hopefully at some stage granted by the court. But that would be with justification.
So you could have been involved directing or influencing some of the decisions that were being taken.
But from my perspective, that should not have to come to my level. It's that all these issues ought to be able to be resolved. Everybody ought to know what the procedures are. And we've got one good example of a police officer who obviously knows what his, or maybe he didn't, but at least he had the sense to ask the question. So in terms of the herbal substance, so that's what you would expect of people, is if they're not sure, then escalate to get a resolution.
And seek that advice from a more senior
Yes, exactly.
ranking officer.
Exactly.
Can I ask you then about an example that I've been thinking of, and you can tell me if this is not helpful. You are faced, you're Gold Commander, you're faced with an unascertained death. There's an
Yes.
investigation ongoing. The day after the death, there's a post-mortem, and the initial post-mortem report says cause of death is unascertained, pending investigations, namely toxicology. And there's one of the hypotheses that's being developed is the unascertained death is because it's perhaps a drug-induced death. It's possible, and the initial post-mortem doesn't rule that out, and in fact they're waiting for toxicology results to determine that. And so one of the hypotheses could develop into perhaps there's been a supply of illicit drugs to the deceased by a third party, and possibly a charge of culpable homicide would be levelled against someone in the future.
Yep.
So a drug-induced death where that is a hypothesis that's being potentially going to develop. There's a number of properties to be secured, entered and searched as part of that investigation, because the deceased had been in those properties earlier, prior to death. In that situation, would the Gold Group want to be made aware if occupants in those properties declined to give consent for the properties to be secured, entered and searched?
Not necessarily.
Would that also be something that you would expect to be dealt with at a lower level?
Most definitely. People should, at that level, ought to know their powers and what's required of them. If they're not sure, they escalate it, but normally they would escalate it to a sergeant or inspector, who, if the constable wasn't sure, then either one of them ought to be. And then ultimately, in terms of warrants, it would be a contact with the Procurator Fiscal Service, discuss and outline the evidence, the information, why it was necessary, and crave a warrant.
So it should be capable of resolution long before it gets up to the Gold Commander.
Yes.
Right. And that would be even in a case where you're considering a potential homicide in relation to an unascertained death.
So that would be part of the evidence gathering. So I wouldn't expect to be involved in making decisions around about the evidence gathering. That's a matter for the SIO. And so unless something it came to my attention that something was going completely awry, then I wouldn't intervene into how they were going about their business.
I would like to ask you some further questions about the detail of what was going on in the houses, just for your impressions as Gold Commander that day. So if we go back to Martin Dick's property, yes. We heard from Martin Dick in oral evidence, and he'd also given an inquiry statement. He lived at the time with his then partner, Kirsty MacLeod, now his wife. The officers arrived between about 12 and 12:30. He said originally, maybe slightly later, but certainly after the first Gold Group meeting and before the second Gold Group meeting. So that's what was happening with you. He said 9 or 10 officers were sent to his home on the Sunday morning or Sunday lunchtime. That it was intimidating. There were cars. The police arrived. They all came into the house and only one of them spoke. There was 9 in the house. Can you help the chair understand why 9 police officers would arrive at the home of Martin Dick? There's no suggestion that a crime occurred in his property.
So I don't know is the answer to that. I mean, that's for whoever deployed 9 officers to the house to give evidence in terms of that. But at the end of the day, it depends what they were looking for. But if they were looking for something in terms of forensics, and I don't recollect what was said in relation to that, but then having 9 officers in the property is not going to help from a forensics perspective. And so it seems to me like if they thought they required 9 officers for a search, then the appropriate way to go about that would be for 1, 2 to first approach the householder, and then if it was required for a search to have 9 people, then absolutely fine. But it seems a lot of people in a house to carry out a search, if indeed it's in relation to forensics, for instance.
And who would have deployed those officers? Would that be the crime scene manager, or would it be a sergeant, or would it be someone else?
Well, I don't know the detail of that, but presumably the SIO decided, or the deputy SIO decided, that the house had to be seized, searched, whatever, and then he'll have spoken to whoever was in charge of the officers at that time and asked them to deploy to the property, giving some instruction about what was required. Why it was 9 people, I have absolutely no idea.
We heard from Miss Martin Dick that, as well as coming into the property, that an officer was sent upstairs with them while they got changed. It had been a Sunday. They were in their house. They gave us nothing to go on whatsoever, just that we were going to be helping them and we should be helping them. So that's what we did, just cooperated. But the fact they seized our house is still a mystery to us. So when he came to give evidence, he still wasn't able to give an explanation as to why they needed his house to be seized. What comments would you have about that description?
He should have been told why the house was being seized from the beginning. And if he hasn't, then that's just wrong.
We have a statement from Kirsty MacLeod, his partner, and she says one of the officers went upstairs with Martin Martin was getting changed, and stood outside his door. I got changed in the bathroom, and I think there was another officer standing out on the upstairs landing as well. Once I got changed, I was asked to leave my clothes on the ironing board in the kitchen, which I did. I'm not sure what Martin did with his clothes. What comment do you have about that, about officers going upstairs, standing outside the door while the occupants get changed and requiring them to provide their clothing to officers?
Well, so it depends. It absolutely depends on what they've been briefed in relation to. So is it, it feels like what ought to have happened is they were allowed to get changed, and then if the police service wanted their clothes, then they could seize the clothes. But I don't know the detail of exactly what the instruction they were given, why they were given the instruction, and what it was they were trying to achieve by not allowing people just to. Now, if you go to search house for drugs or whatever, then fairly obviously you don't want people to be able to go and dispose of drugs. But I absolutely don't know the basis of why this house was being seized, and the detail of that, and why it would be necessary to be with them when they were, or at least be close by when they're getting changed.
And from what you know of the circumstances as Gold Commander, can you help the Chair understand perhaps a reason why this would have been done?
No, I honestly don't know. And you do need to ask the officers who were there and why that is what they did.
Well, thank you. An explanation that was given to Kirsty MacLeod comes from her inquiry statement, SBPI 00220. I don't need this up on the screen, I'll just tell you what it says. It's paragraph 45. I asked if I could go and get changed, and before I went upstairs they told me to leave out the clothes I'd been wearing. They explained this by saying they might have to rule out my DNA from Sheik, as I had earlier told them that I had cuddled Sheik when he arrived at the house that morning. And then we have her original statement that she gave to PERC 00054, where she said in there, they explained this by saying they might have to rule out my DNA from Sheik because of this cuddle. Can I ask you what you make of that explanation that was given apparently to Kirsty MacLeod?
Well, I would need to understand why they needed to rule out her DNA from Sheik because of a cuddle. I mean, I don't know.
As Gold Commander,
yeah.
In relation to this incident, can you think of a reason why officers would need Kirsty MacLeod's DNA from giving Sheik a cuddle?
No, but I mean, if there was a reason for DNA to have to be eliminated, so there, if his clothing or whatever had a number of different DNA on it, there might be a reason why you would want to eliminate, and so that part of it's got nothing to do with inquiry or whatever. So, but again, these would be questions for the SIO and Deputy SIO in terms of what it was they were trying to achieve by understanding her DNA being on the other clothing.
We'd like to try and understand why, in relation to this incident at Hayfield Road, where Sheik Ubayo has been restrained by officers, why there would be a need to exclude Kirsty MacLeod's DNA. She wasn't present at that time.
No.
She wasn't at Hayfield Road. There was never any suggestion that she'd been involved in any way with Mr. Bayo in an altercation or any other physical way other than the cuddle. Can you think of a reason why that would reasonably be required from Kirsty MacLeod?
No, at this moment in time I can't. But But the truth is that, I don't have that level of detail. I wouldn't expect to have that level of detail, but, whoever it is that's directed that to happen is the individual who ought to justify and explain why it is that they felt that was important.
We'd like to try and understand why that would be important. If there is a reason you can think of, then...
No, sorry, I can't.
All right, thank you. And I've asked witnesses about why DNA wasn't taken from the officers, and an answer that was given was that's already on file on a database. I think that's correct, is it?
That is correct, yes.
There's also an SOP that permits officers' DNA to be taken, and it relates to the firearms SOP we were talking about yesterday. It doesn't happen in all circumstances, and it depends on the exact situation. At any time, was there consideration given by the Gold Group as to whether DNA should be taken from the officers?
No, not at all. But as you already outlined, it's already on the database, so...
So
it would be,
not necessary.
So it wouldn't be necessary to take the DNA. Every officer's fingerprints and DNA are taken when they join the organisation and stored, so they can be compared and will be compared. Again, where again it's justified.
Given what I've told you about the description of events from the occupiers in Martin Dick's house, do you have concerns about the way that was handled? You've obviously given us your views on the number of officers who attended, but do you have any views or any concerns about the officers following them up the stairs, standing outside recovering clothing and requiring DNA?
Well, so again, back to what I said, it's about the officers that were there to justify why it is that they felt, whether they were instructed to do that, and it's someone else to justify it. But it would be posing the question of them. I don't know. I don't have that level of detail. I wouldn't expect to have that level of detail. But I would expect, every house that consent's properly obtained and people are dealt with respect, fairness and respect. And if that's not what happened, then that shouldn't be what's happening.
We've heard from Martin Dick, and Kirsty MacLeod has given a statement that they were taken to Kirkcaldy Police Office to give statements. Mm-hmm. They were taken separately in separate cars. And can you explain to us why that would be done in that situation?
Well, I don't know, because I wasn't there, but I would assume that they wanted to speak to them separately, and it would, if there's a lengthy statement to be taken, it would probably be more conducive in an office where they could have the space, perhaps show them a number of items if that was required, productions if that was required. I don't know the detail of that, but again, it would be for the officers who actually brought them to the office to give you an understanding of exactly why that happened. But of course, there can be situations where you want to keep people separate, you want to take them to an office, and then you want to interview them and get a full statement from them.
What would the reasons be for keeping people separate?
So that they don't talk to each other.
Right. To avoid collusion or conferral or...
Exactly.
After giving a statement, Martin Dick explained that when he left Kirkcaldy Police Office, he met up with Kirsty, and it actually was Kirsty that told him that his friend Sheku Bayo had died. So he had given a full statement to the police officers for over a number of hours and not been told that Mr. Bayo had died. Does that cause you concern?
It causes me a lot of concern.
Why?
Well, he ought to have been told, so that when he gives his statement, he knows and understands exactly why he's giving a statement.
Thank you. We've heard from Dev Kapadia in this inquiry about Martin Dick's house. He was a senior fiscal on duty that day on call. This is on day 38, 7th of February this year. And he spoke about receiving a call from police in connection with officers seeking a drug search warrant for Martin Dick's property. This related to the herbal material. And he described in evidence that it seemed to him at the time that the link to the death of Sheku Bayo was somewhat tenuous. He said it did not appear that the death resulted from the drugs or that there was any previous intelligence of drug dealing at the property. It did not appear to me that a search warrant was proportionate in those circumstances. And he said that the quantities were so small, they wouldn't be marked for court prosecution, and they would not reach the threshold for prosecution. What would you expect police officers to do in that situation, where they've contacted a fiscal to seek a drugs warrant, and the fiscal has expressed views that it simply wouldn't be prosecuted because the amounts, I think the word he used in evidence was minute.
Yes.
Minute amounts.
So I would expect them to seize them and take no other action.
Take no other action. Is that an option open to officers, to take no other action?
Well, they've already been clearly instructed by a fiscal that the fiscal's not prepared to take it forward in terms of prosecution. So it seems, you know, what course of action can you take?
And would you expect those officers to charge the occupants of the property with offences under the Misuse of Drugs Act?
Well, they may well have believed that was the right course of action, because, as they believed, there was a quantity of herbal material there. But it seems, you know, if you interpret what the senior fiscal has said, then it's never going to go beyond. So they can charge the individual, but it's never going to go to prosecution, never going to go to court, and it's never going to go to prosecution. So it's, in my view, a needless use of their time to proceed with that.
Thank you. We've heard that Martin Dick and Kirsty MacLeod had a dog at the time, and they'd left the property without dog food. And Martin Dick had a vehicle, his own vehicle, that he needed to go use for work. And that a request had been made, but they weren't provided with access to the property to recover those items, and no one was willing to get those items for him. So Mr. Dick wasn't able to go to work that evening because the house was still secured by the officers. Do you have concerns about that?
I do.
What are those?
I mean, why would someone not just go and provide him with the keys for his car, whatever? I don't know.
Can you think of any reason why that wouldn't be done?
No.
I'd like to move on to Zaid Saheed's property. We've heard that the police arrived there between about 1 and 1:30, roughly, that day, 3rd of May. I've asked you about consent and the warrant and such like. We've heard evidence from Mrs. Rashid and her father. We've heard that one of the occupiers in the property at that time was disabled, that he was in a wheelchair and required specialist equipment which was available in the home. He had aids and equipment adaptations. He had mental health issues and issues with communication as a result of a brain injury which he'd sustained. Can you tell us what would you expect officers on the ground to do when they are dealing with an occupier who has these difficulties?
Well, take cognizance of what the difficulties are and make sure that we can support that individual.
And What steps would you expect officers to take to secure reasonable access for him to the equipment that he needs?
Well, so I suppose it would depend on whether, it was deemed appropriate for him to access what he needed within his own property, or whether actually what we ought to do is take him out with that property and find him what he required elsewhere, which presumably we would be able to access through our partners, NHS, some of the groups that we're involved with NHS.
We've heard evidence that he had the need to lie down on occasions, and he had a special bed adapted for his own use.
Yep.
So my understanding is it would not have been easy for that
Right.
to be moved out of the property. I mentioned Stuart Houston's inquiry statement, and we read out paragraphs to you earlier, and we know that it was his impression as crime scene coordinator that all the police required was the clothing and the car. So in terms of what was inside the house they were looking for, it was simply clothing.
Yes.
We've heard evidence, a suggestion, that the family asked if they could remain in one room in the house, that the disabled son would be able to access the toilet and use the equipment that he needed. And that was declined, that request. Does that cause you concern?
Yes, of course.
And why would that cause you concern?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious that we should be supporting the family in that situation. And if we're merely looking for clothing, and at this stage I don't know exactly what they were looking for, but Stuart Houston's says that, so I can't see any reason whatsoever. Go and seize the clothing, have the family help you find the clothing and take it, and then leave them to go on with their day-to-day business. It doesn't seem too difficult. And
we've also heard evidence that Mrs. Rashid had recent surgery, was on medication, she had recently had a child. So she had a young baby, and the baby had also had recent surgery. And what would you expect the police officers to do to assist her with her particular needs? Well,
find out what her particular needs were and deal with that in an appropriate fashion. Be fair, respect people. You can still achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve, but do it in a proper fashion.
We've heard that after the family were asked to leave, she had forgotten some medication. She'd forgotten to retrieve breast milk and breast pumps from the property. Can you think of any reason why someone would not go and get her?
No, absolutely no reason.
We've heard that her mother was an elderly woman who had health problems herself, was on medication. She spoke little or no English. And again, what would you expect officers on the ground to do in terms of dealing with the mother?
Well, treat her with fairness and respect. If we needed to get an interpreter, make sure she knew and understood what was happening, then that's what we ought to be doing.
We've heard evidence from Mrs. Rashid that she was a Muslim woman. She was wearing traditional clothing, but she was given no explanation why the police were there asking them to leave the house. She'd asked for a warrant. She was followed up to her bedroom while a male officer waited outside her room while she dressed, and that during the police visit she had made a call to a relative and the phone was grabbed from her hand by the officer as she was on the phone. Can I ask you to comment about that?
Well, none of that should have been done.
And why do you say that?
Well, back to what I said already, treating people with fairness, respect. We should respect individuals. But at the end of the day, all this is about the individuals on the ground explaining and justifying what it is that they've done. But it feels like if everything that's said is true, then they're not going to be able to justify it.
Could you help the chair looking at what I've said to you, and obviously it's a matter for the chair what evidence he accepts in the future, but if he accepts any of that evidence, could you see a way forward that situations like this could be avoided in the future, where these things are handled well, handled properly?
Well, it sounds like there needs to be training. Needs to be development of protocols and people's understanding of exactly what's expected of them. There will be protocols in place, and there will have been some training, but it feels like if all of this is what's happened, then that training needs to be reinforced.
And with your experience, can you envisage a sort of best type of training that would help officers make good decisions in these scenarios?
Well, a lot of the training will come from classroom-based, understanding in terms of, sounds like diversity, actual protocols and how they go about their business, what's expected of them. But some will be on-the-job training, so people getting experience from other experienced people who have undertaken this work on a very regular basis.
Thank you. As with yesterday, we've now reached 11:30, and I think what I'd like to do now is ask to speak to the chair and invite him to have a brief adjournment. So I'll ask that the chair could perhaps be brought on the screen. I wonder if now might be an appropriate time for our morning break.
Yes, thank you. We'll stop for 20 minutes at this point. Please continue, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd just like to conclude the questions I'm asking in relation to the home of Zaid Saheed. And we also heard evidence from Mrs. Rashid that she's the sister of Zaid Saheed, that outside the house the police searched her car, and that at some point that day, I don't have a precise time, Zaid Saheed was brought to the house by police officers sitting in a car, and her other brother or her dad went over to talk to Zaid Saheed, but the police wouldn't let him talk to him, and Zaid was kept in the car. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand why that wouldn't be permitted, that his family weren't allowed to speak to him?
No, I don't know. I don't have that level of detail of exactly what it is that they were dealing with at that stage, or why he was brought back, or why it would be that they didn't want him to speak, but to anybody, but there might be reason for that.
Can you think of a reason, from your knowledge of this incident in terms of your position as Gold Commander?
No, I can't, but neither can I say that wasn't justified. I just don't know, because fairly obviously the officers that were involved, if that's what's happened, then they've believed that that's in the best interests of the investigation that they were carrying out. But again, that's for them to explain and to justify. So sorry, I just don't have the level of detail that would allow me to make an informed judgment. If I had the whole detail, then I would be able to help, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to deal with something we've heard evidence about from a number of witnesses called hypotheses.
Yes.
I think we've mentioned that very briefly before. I'd like to look at it in some detail now. So we've heard that where you have an unascertained death as a police officer, and you're investigating why someone has died, that hypotheses will be considered and developed, perhaps excluded,
yes,
as you go along, and essentially you're narrowing down,
yes,
trying to determine what happened.
It wouldn't necessarily be unexplained. You could have hypothesis in terms of a murder inquiry, so where you know what the cause of death is, stab wound, a shooting, whatever, but you would have hypothesis in terms of the individual responsible for it and ascertaining exactly what's happened. So it's just slightly more broad than just an unexplained death.
Thank you. We've heard evidence from Gary McEwen about this, and we've heard evidence from Leslie Bole about this.
Yep.
And we also heard evidence from Leslie Bole about the 3 stages of an investigation and how you start considering hypotheses,
yes,
and they will develop as time moves on. We'll come back to that. And we also heard evidence from Pat Campbell that he was considering hypotheses as he was travelling to Kirkcaldy. And as SIO, we've heard that was a sort of normal part of the process.
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at an inquiry statement from Leslie Bole, SBPI 00233, and I'm going to look at a number of paragraphs. It's a summary of possible hypotheses that could be developed in relation to this incident. And if we start, you'll see on the screen a witness statement from Detective Chief Superintendent Leslie Bole, as she was then, which she gave the inquiry team last year. And she gave evidence at day 65 of the inquiry. Can we start with paragraph 117? And you'll see this is headed up investigative hypotheses. And she said, as SIO, you have to consider what these hypotheses are and rule them in or out. Criminality of the police officers is a hypothesis. It's for the SIO to decide other hypotheses and what should be done to investigate them. A number might be investigated together. Do you agree with that
Yes,
description?
yes, that's correct.
118. I think it's good to list what they are. I think the hypotheses approach is mentioned in training. In terms of the murder manual, which is a guide for how to investigate homicides, there is a section on hypotheses in that document. For me, and I can't say this for everybody, it allows me to think about every possibility to make sure you're either eliminating a possibility or finding the evidence and following that evidence to see how far it takes you. Again, you agree with that?
I do.
119. In terms of Mr. Bio, we learned later on there was a disturbance at an address he'd been at. The question was whether Mr. Bio was involved, who else was involved, what type of disturbance took place, and was anyone assaulted during the disturbance. One hypothesis for me would have been, was Mr. Bio assaulted prior to coming into contact with police, and if so, was the assault relevant to any injuries he received or relevant to the cause of death? Is that a reasonable hypothesis?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And we've heard evidence from, in relation to a physical altercation that Mr. Zaid Sahid had with Sheku Bio prior to his later death. So when she's talking about that, that's the altercation, I think, that is providing the basis for that hypothesis. And then if we go on to the next paragraph, 120, another hypothesis would be, was his death due to an underlying medical condition? And information would be obtained from his GP and or specialist, and statement from family members. If I was SIO, I would normally list my hypotheses or anything that may be relevant in terms of a potential cause of death. So again, an underlying health condition, medical condition, could be one of the reasons why Mr. Bio died.
Yes, that's correct.
And Leslie Bull gave evidence that that's quite a simple thing to start investigating. You can recover GP records, medical records, and she said that the pathologist would like those for the post-mortem as well.
That's correct.
And she said Leslie Bull had experience, she told us, as an SIO, and she said if she was SIO, she would normally list her hypotheses. Is that something that you would say is good practice?
Yes, I would say it's good practice, yeah.
And would that be listed in the policy file?
Yes.
And then she says, I would note down the hypotheses and then allocate out priority actions, the most likely hypotheses initially. Where there is no evidence to support a hypothesis, it can be eliminated. That's not to say every SIO is the same. Some will and some won't. Also, hypotheses ensure you don't exclude anything. Some things could be overlooked otherwise. Do you agree with what she said?
Yes, I agree with that.
And I think yesterday you gave evidence, and we don't need to go into this any further, that hypotheses about counter-terrorism was very quickly checked out and excluded at an early stage.
That's it, yes.
And then 121, she said, Chief Superintendent McEwen and I didn't discuss the nature of the investigation. Race as a possibility was not discussed with Chief Superintendent McEwen. However, it is in the back of your mind when you're thinking about all possibilities. In terms of hypotheses, one would have been that the male had been treated differently because he was a black male. I can't remember having a conversation with anybody else about it, but the feeling I got was that everybody was thinking along the same lines as me, that it was a possibility that the actions of the police officers or a police officer was because Mr. Bio was black. And again, do you agree that that was one of the potential possible hypotheses?
Yes, I agree. Yes.
Right. So in terms of you as Gold Commander, you had all of those possibilities and all of those hypotheses in your mind.
Yes.
Did you need Pat Campbell in the Gold Group to explain his hypotheses to you? Is that part of the briefing?
No. So he went through in detail, but at the end of the day, the strategic intention, and we've gone through it in a bit of detail, is to carry out a thorough investigation. But in this case, the case that we're dealing with at this moment in time, then fairly obviously, as I've said on a number of occasions, our role was to stabilise everything. Make sure that it was all held for a PERC investigation, which was going to be undertaken, so the organisation being investigated. So yes, of course, making sure that we understood what the hypotheses were and make sure that we gathered and secured all the information that would allow them to carry out an investigation that would consider every one of these hypotheses.
So these are alive at an early stage, and then, as I understand the evidence of Leslie Bowl, the hypotheses develop and evolve as the investigation continues.
That's it. They come directly. Hypotheses come directly from the murder manual, which it'll have been updated, but I think it was written around about 2008, and it's been updated on a number of occasions. I think north of the border it's called Serious Crime Protocol, but it's taken, that protocol is taken directly from the murder manual, which is written by the Association of Chief Police Officers Homicide Working Group. And I actually sat on that group when the murder manual was written, and I brought the murder manual north of the border and had it revamped in terms of legislation from a Scottish perspective, because obviously our legislation, our detention powers, that's all changed now, but our detention powers were completely different from south of the border. So the vast majority of it developed, the theory of hypothesis developed by the Homicide Working Group, and then brought here in terms of a Scottish understanding of. So every SIO, ought to know and understand about hypothesis and where that comes from. And then on the SIO course at Tullyallen, they would be taken through the various aspects of an investigation and how to use hypothesis to support the investigation that they're undertaking.
So in terms of the role of an SIO who's heading up, and the senior investigative officer heading up an investigation, if that relates to someone's death, they will have had training in hypotheses and the use of hypotheses.
Yes.
And they're designed to help the investigation and make sure nothing's missed.
Yes, that's correct.
And when we were talking about hypotheses, and Leslie Bowles given us this description, does this protocol specify that underlying health conditions could be a hypothesis?
Does the manual specify that? No. I mean, it's left open in terms of the particular circumstances. So you couldn't specify in a manual just, every single inquiry you would come across, because we have many inquiries, and everyone wouldn't be that different, but they will have everyone will have nuances and will be a bit different. So just understanding the theory of hypothesis and then applying that to what it is that you have in front of you. So a hypothesis for every element of what it is that would be important, so that you don't go down one route, and leave everything else behind. You take everything with you, and as you eliminate, so if you've got 5 hypotheses, then one at a time you'll eliminate the hypothesis until you come to have one that says whatever the conclusion happens to be at that point.
Right. And what do you need to eliminate a hypothesis?
Well, it'll depend what the hypothesis is.
Let's look at, for example, underlying health condition.
Yes.
And so that's a hypothesis,
yes.
A possibility, and you maybe recover GP records, hospital records, information from the family.
Yes.
And would you then send that to the pathologist who's carrying out the post-mortem?
Yes, so somebody would go to the post-mortem and would take that so that the pathologist has that available to them.
And would you look at the records and say that's enough, we're excluding that, or would you wait until the post-mortem has been concluded and see what the pathologist said? Yes,
exactly. So as a police officer, you wouldn't have the knowledge, the ability to make a determination without having medical expertise applied to it. So take it along, pathologists will have a look at all of that and decide whether in fact there was an underlying, of course the records, the GP records, the health records may well show that there was in any event, so and in which case it might not be eliminated, but the pathologist would be able to say whether it has an impact, you would hope, on the death or not.
So it remains alive until you've gathered in all the information you can get.
Yes, that's correct.
About the person's prior health history, and then a decision would be taken to exclude that hypothesis or say this is actually the reason.
Yes, that's it.
So in that situation, with that example, you're not going to say within the first 24 hours, 48 hours, we don't have evidence from the pathologist, but we're satisfied that we can exclude this as a cause.
No.
And if the pathologist produces an initial post-mortem saying cause of death unascertained, pending further investigations, would you wait until those further investigations have been carried out?
Yeah, you should.
You should. Thank you. And in relation to the other example that was given here, of the possibility of an assault,
Yes.
what would you do as an investigator in relation to that hypothesis?
Well, you gather information in relation to it, so take statements, understand what happened, and again take that detail to the pathologist to say there's this suggestion that there was an altercation previously, that there was an injury previously, whatever the detail is, and so that they can make the best informed judgment on what they see.
We've also heard from evidence from the pathologist in this case who talked about injuries underlying the external, so internal injuries that maybe wouldn't be obvious from the external presentation of the body. So again, if you had an initial post-mortem report saying unascertained cause of death, again, would you be waiting until you get the final post-mortem report to take a view on that hypothesis?
Yes, so you would follow the evidence. So, if you haven't got all the statements and the detail at the time that you have the initial post-mortem, then you subsequently bring that detail to the pathologist to say, we now understand that there's been an altercation and there might have been injury or whatever. Has that had any impact on the cause of death? And
we heard from Dr. Shearer, the pathologist, that there can be very obvious injuries such as blunt force injuries, stab wounds to the heart, a shot to the head, that make it very clear at a very early stage what the cause of
yes,
death
of
is. And so presumably that's something that circumstances can be taken into account.
Yes, that's right.
If it's an obvious cause.
Yes, that's right.
And then in relation to this possibility that we see on the screen at 121, this hypothesis that the male had been treated differently because he was a black male. Can you explain to us how you would go about investigating this hypothesis?
Well, you would have to, understand exactly what's happened and whether the police officers took a different course of action because the person was black. So you'd have to understand what it was they did and why it was they did it and what was their why they made the judgments that they actually made. So, but these would be taking statements from the variety of people round about, understanding CCTV and see what had happened and how the person was arrested. And then from the statements of the officers themselves, understanding exactly what it is that they did.
And you wouldn't rule out that possibility until you've obtained all of that information?
No, not at all.
And so you've talked about statements from people. Would that be possible eyewitnesses?
Eyewitnesses, CCTV.
And statements from the police officers themselves?
Yes.
And we also heard from Leslie Bowl that looking at the airwaves transmissions at the time might be helpful evidence.
Yes, of course, yes.
She talked about disciplinary records could perhaps be part of the evidence gathering.
Yes, I agree.
We've also heard about call cards or storm cards that might provide interesting information about the circumstances.
Yeah.
Do you agree with all of that?
Yes, all of that. So you want to gather all of that information.
And again, the outcome of the post-mortem
Yes, absolutely.
may be a factor.
Absolutely.
And in a situation where the cause of death in the initial post-mortem is unascertained,
Yeah.
that wouldn't permit you to exclude any hypotheses,
No, not
presumably.
at all. Not at all. I mean, you're waiting for further information and further detail and potentially further examination. So.
Thank you. And we heard from Leslie Bowl in relation to this hypothesis. She explained that it can be difficult to investigate the motivation behind
Yes,
actions. Would you agree with that?
No, I absolutely agree with that.
And she talked about looking at the possibility whether Mr. Bio's ethnicity had impacted or caused officers to react differently at their initial attendance. And so when they first had contact with Mr. Bio and thereafter during the restraint of Mr. Bio, whether that is stereotyping, discrimination, whether they wanted to undertake a sort of malicious act, intent, or recklessness in terms of his care. And that is the sort of thing you're looking at when you're investigating whether race was a factor.
Yes, absolutely.
And she explained that it would help an investigating officer if they knew what the attending officers had done, whether they'd been engaged in the restraint,
Yes.
whether they'd not been engaged, if they were witnesses to things, what had happened, who'd done what.
Yes.
And I think she said in evidence, and I'm summarising here, that on the 3rd of May, it was difficult to have a clear view on what the officers had actually done. The
Yes.
officers who were gathered in the canteen.
Yeah.
She didn't have a clear picture of who'd done what.
No.
Would that be your accord with your recollection of
No,
events on the 3rd of
that's
May?
absolutely correct.
And until we've heard officers gave statements to PERC on the 4th of June, just over a month after these
Yes.
events. And you told us yesterday you didn't actually have those copies of those statements. And you told us yesterday you didn't have copies of, well, they weren't completed, use of force or use
Yes,
of spray
yes.
forms. So at what point was it possible for Police Scotland to exclude this hypothesis that race was a factor in the absence of statements or forms or any of that information?
Well, so when the PERC carried out their investigation and concluded that investigation, you would expect, and we're talking here about the police service and what the police service would do, but you would expect that when the inquiry is handed over to the PERC, that, you know, that's exactly what they would be investigating as well. So from a Police Scotland perspective, you know, as I said before, it's about stabilising, it's about holding everything, making sure just everything that Leslie's spoken about there, make sure that we've got that's available to the PERC, and that they then are allowed, you know, that we don't interfere in that in any way whatsoever. They are allowed to go and carry out an independent, objective inquiry, and then to come back, and in this case they've come back to the fiscal with the facts. I don't know, I haven't seen that report. I don't know what it says, but I would have expected that all of these hypotheses would have been considered. Now, of course, and some of them are ex-police officers, and some of them will have used this in the past, but I don't know, and I wouldn't speculate on exactly what the expectation from a PERC perspective is.
And just thinking about that at the moment, so these are hypotheses that an SIO would be considering developing as part of a police investigation.
Yes.
And you would anticipate that from the handover that PERC would continue with those hypotheses?
Yes.
And bearing in mind what you said about PERC having an independent investigation, presumably what you're saying is that they wouldn't be limited to the police hypotheses if they felt there were other important
No,
hypotheses to consider.
Absolutely not.
So they could continue with the police hypotheses, they could perhaps add to them
Yes.
themselves based on their own investigation.
Yes.
And in terms of sharing those hypotheses, we've not heard from PERC yet
No,
about what
no.
they've done or training they've had on hypotheses. But in terms of that handover between, say, Pat Campbell, the SIO,
Yep.
and the PERC investigation, can you explain to us what your expectations would be in terms of that sharing of information about hypotheses and that?
I would expect us to share everything that we had in terms of property, productions, CCTV witnesses, a bit of a discussion around about who is going to be doing what in the future. And yes, Pat Campbell explaining what it was that he believed, he was investigating, so what were his hypotheses, and then handing that over to the PERC. But I wouldn't expect the PERC to tell us what their hypothesis were. So they come up with their own. So whether they would describe it as hypothesis or something else, I don't know. But I wouldn't expect them to share that with us. I would expect them to get on with the inquiry, and they would have an expectation that we would give them everything that we had, that we would hand everything that Leslie has spoken about there, that we would hand that over to them, and that they would carry out the investigation on behalf of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service.
So in a way, even if Pat Campbell didn't give any of his own hypotheses to PERC,
Yes.
you would expect PERC would develop and evolve their own views about possibilities,
Yes.
whether they call them hypotheses or
Yes.
not, but they would develop their own theories that they would investigate.
Yes.
And presumably from what you've said, you would expect, either because they've been told by Pat Campbell or they've developed it themselves, that one of the possibilities that they'd look into would be that Mr. Bai was treated differently because he was black.
Yes.
Thank you. And Leslie Bowell talked about, it was clear at that time in 2015 that, this was a black male who'd been restrained. He'd become unresponsive during restraint. It wasn't a unique case in the sense that this had happened before elsewhere in the UK. And we've also heard other people talking about, worldwide.
Yes.
There are examples. At a very early stage, there was mention of George Floyd, and we've heard of people down south who have been restrained by police.
Yes.
And who have subsequently lost consciousness and died. Was that something that you were aware of, the sort of global picture or the national picture across the UK?
Oh, absolutely, definitely, yes.
Right. And so was this something in your mind at the time that you were considering how the investigation would be conducted?
Yeah, well, so I think we had to be absolutely cognizant of that. But as I said, the most important thing at that moment in time is to allow the PERC to carry out that inquiry, and potentially not for us to say, well, we think it's this and we think it's that, we don't think it's this, but to say, you've got everything now, anything else that you want, please ask, and then please get on with the inquiry, because as I said yesterday in a few occasions, I suppose, the sooner the PERC pick it up, carrying out an independent, objective inquiry, the better overall for the police service. Now, of course, we might have got things wrong, and if we did, then we need to do something about it, so we need to learn from it. So the quicker we find that out and learn from it and change things, but different procedures, the better for everybody. The more confidence the public will have in us, and the more confidence families and communities can have in us. So the importance of their independence and us not necessarily interfering into that, or not interfering into that independence at all, is really important.
I was going to ask you later today, but I might as well ask you now about learning lessons. I mean, how difficult was it for the police to learn lessons in the absence of getting the PERC report or any detail from PERC?
Well, I mean, so it would be difficult. 'Cause in many ways, we would have to go back and reinvestigate some of the things that have already been investigated. But, yeah. But, as I said, we try to learn from every incident. That's what we should be doing.
Were you in? Sorry, I interrupted
No, go on.
there.
No, sorry.
No, sorry about that. I was going to ask you, were you involved in any learning lessons exercises after the death of
No, I
Mr.
wasn't.
Pyle?
No.
No. Were you asked to contribute to any learning lessons?
No, I can't
process?
remember at this stage. So I would have done, the goal group and over to PERC, and then I would have got on, at some stage, once I was content that it was stabilised, as I've said many times, I would have then gone on to do, the job that I was expected to do in terms of Police Scotland. So I would have worked away at that and allowed this inquiry then to continue, because at some stage I was content that the PERC were engaged, they were carrying out an investigation, and I suppose wrongly I assumed that we would have got some kind of feedback from the PERC in terms of, and then so that would have been fed into the force centrally. Well, sorry, this is why I assumed would happen, and of course I might be completely wrong in that was never going to happen, but that's what I assumed would happen, and so it's maybe a missed opportunity on my part that we should have done something else.
And in terms of that assumption that they would come back, had you been given information in relation to the PERC investigation, either from PERC themselves or from the Crown, would that have assisted you in learning lessons?
Yeah, if there was feedback from the PERC or feedback from the Crown, then but I assume the feedback from the Crown would have gone directly back to either Neil Richardson through PSD, or feedback from the PERC would have come back in through that route, not through myself.
So you think it would actually have been professional standards,
yes,
who would have maybe had that ongoing contact or possible contact? That's
it, yes, that's correct.
Did professional standards ever get in touch with you about
No.
a learning lessons exercise?
No, not that I recall.
Right. Going back to the hypotheses that we were talking about, can I ask you, as Gold Commander, what role, if any, would you have had in listening to the hypotheses, discussing the hypotheses? We know yesterday you asked about counter-terrorism, but apart from that, was there any discussion at Gold Group meetings about the hypotheses?
There might have been some discussion, but and in terms of what the the strategy was, but I would need to look at the minutes of the meetings to see whether that was the case or not. So, but I wouldn't expect to be dictating, if that's the right word, what the hypothesis would be. I would expect the SIO to understand what the incident was and then to come up with a hypothesis himself, as it was in this case. But so someone as experienced as him and someone as experienced as Leslie Bowell, as we've seen, should be allowed to come up with hypotheses that they believe are correct for that investigation. So I wouldn't interfere into that unless there was something so obvious that that I should interfere into it.
Do you think that what's described in paragraph 121 on the screen about the race hypotheses, if I can call it that, do you think that was obvious to everybody involved that day?
I think it should have been.
Do you think it was? You'll see from this, I've read it out to you, Leslie Bowell didn't speak. She didn't remember having a conversation with anyone else about it.
Yeah.
But the feeling she got was that everybody was thinking along the same lines. Would that accord with you?
I think that's probably right, yes.
Okay. So if we've heard that people weren't thinking along those lines, what would you make of that?
Well, I think that they should be thinking about that, but again, it's back to what I've said already. We aren't the investigating institution. We are being investigated, and so it's allowing the investigators to come up with the hypothesis and to carry out a thorough investigation to understand exactly what it is that happened on that day.
Thank you. We've heard evidence in this inquiry that some witnesses have said there was simply no evidence that this was racially motivated. And there was nothing from the outset to suggest that the actions of the officers were because Mr. Bai was black. And I'm interested in any comment you have about that, the idea that there was nothing at the outset. And
well,
so
I think it depends on how you define evidence. So was there was no evidence at the very beginning. So, so some people will be saying that because you follow the evidence. Mm-hmm. So you wait until, without making a determination, without deciding, oh, it's definitely this or it's definitely that, or you keep a broad perspective in terms of your hypothesis. So 5 or 6 hypotheses, and you work your way through each one. You understand that some are eliminated very quickly and very easily. Some will be really difficult to eliminate. But at some stage you will come to a point where there is only one hypothesis left. And as long as you've kept it broad enough and you allow, and you've thought of everything, then, because if you haven't thought of everything, then when you come to the last one, there might just have been something else that you needed to have thought about. So it's just making sure that you're completely open-minded. Don't jump down a route and say, oh, well, I think it was this or I think it was that. Don't do any of that. Just follow the evidence. From my perspective, that's the important thing to do. And then, because we end up, and it'll have happened, we say one thing and then discover weeks down the road that it's absolutely not that, and it wasn't that. So, and then you've got to start working your way back and then trying to move forward. And weeks later, it's much, much more difficult to move forward. So take everything with you and follow all the evidence. And if you do that, then you'll have a thorough inquiry and you'll have the proper outcome for what it is that you've done.
And does this go back to what you said earlier this morning, that you're keeping an open mind, you're keeping these hypotheses alive, and you're not excluding things until you've got all the evidence that allows you to do that?
Absolutely right.
And in relation to this hypothesis, I think you said not long ago that you would want statements from the police officers.
Yes.
Which were obviously taken by PERC by this stage in this particular investigation. But you would, from a police perspective, you'd want those before you ruled anything out.
That's correct.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at your inquiry statement, please? And at paragraph 121, I think. And I just want to put this into context of what we're discussing now, so that there's no confusion. You say here, 121, race wasn't a factor for Police Scotland to investigate at that time. These are always things that you have in your mind. From my perspective, the investigation into what's actually happened and the causes are with the PERC. If they come back and say there's an element of racism, then you have to do something about that. As far as I know, in the time I was there was no suggestion that race played a part in what happened. I had been asked if there was anything to suggest race wasn't a factor. I don't suppose there was, but from what was reported at the beginning, we had an individual running about between cars with a knife. That's the action of the individual, I think. As the investigation goes on, there's a better understanding of what goes on there. From that initial part of the investigation, it didn't feel to me like race was the cause of this happening. Thorough investigation ought to unearth all the various aspects of what happened. you're open to all of it. So in these investigations, you're looking for all the issues and understanding all the issues. And this includes understanding the motivations of Mr. Bio and the police officers. And so I'm taking that paragraph in its entirety.
Yes.
And I wonder, if we look at the first line, and I don't want there to be any confusion, you say race wasn't a factor for Police Scotland to investigate at that time. Can you put this paragraph into context in light of what you've already told us today?
Yeah, just exactly. What I said was the investigation, the cause of death, what happened is for the PERC to investigate. So from our perspective, it was about stabilising everything, making sure that everything was available to the PERC and for them to continue with their investigation. So I've gone through there to say, well, at that point, there was no evidence of what had happened. So I was keeping a very open mind in terms of what we were doing. So I wasn't going down the route of saying, yes, it's racism. I was saying, well, there's no evidence of that at this moment in time, but it's in the back of my mind that might be the case. But let's get an inquiry done before we start to make allegations against anyone. And once we carry out the proper, thorough investigation, then we can make whatever assertions or allegations that we want to make at that point. But to make assertions and allegations at the very beginning wouldn't be the right thing to do.
And presumably it goes back to what you've just said about the hypothesis remains a live one.
Yes.
And equally, you don't want to make unfounded allegations, but you don't want to exclude a hypothesis that race is a factor until you've investigated all of the evidence you can gather. And part of that, which you see at the end of this paragraph, is I think you mentioned the police officers understanding the motivations of Mr. Bio and the police officers.
Yes, absolutely.
And is a part of that getting the statements of the police officers?
It is, yes.
Lovely, thank you. Can I ask you if you were aware in your role that we've heard evidence from the family that they had raised on the 3rd of May the possibility that race was a factor? Was that something that was drawn to your attention in the Gold Group?
I don't recollect that, but it may well have been. But back to what I said, please let us have an investigation, and then we'll make judgments as we move forward. So without prejudging. So if the family come and make allegations that it's it's race motivated by race, then that ought to feed through at least the SIO in terms of what his consideration, and then that needs to be fed to the PERC, and that information needs to be fed to the PERC in terms of what investigation they carry out.
Who would be responsible for sharing that information with the PERC?
Well, the SIO.
The SIO. And in terms of if the family have had a discussion with officers from Police Scotland who have, where they've raised the issue that race was perhaps a factor in his death, would it be for those individual officers to then share that with the SIO?
Yes, I would assume that at some stage a statement would be taken and outlining the detail of and why they believe that that's the case. So, that would be a starting point in terms of having that understanding. But again, just joining all that together with all the rest of the information that comes in, and then being able to, once you've got all the information in the round, being able to make a judgment on what exactly it is that you've got, but without prejudging what you have at that point.
And in terms of taking statements, that would be something that PERC would be doing as part of the investigation, is it?
Well, so we spoke about yesterday about the officers providing operational statements, but they wouldn't go into the level of detail that you would require for that. So when it came to providing detailed statements, then these are the kind of questions that you would expect would be asked at that time.
And that would be by PERC?
And that would be by PIRC. We would have no involvement whatsoever.
And that would relate to taking statements from the family?
Yes.
And the officers who'd maybe been part of that discussion with the family?
That's correct, yes.
And then, certainly from a police perspective, the PIRC could collate all of that information and develop their own hypotheses or whatever it is they wish to call it.
No, exactly.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraphs 309 and 310 of your inquiry statement? So that's 309 and 310. And it says, we take cognizance of what their perceptions are and understand what is factually following from their perception. So, for example, if the community thinks it's the fault of the police officers, then the investigation has to address that. I have been asked if racism was a perception of the community the investigation was required to address. I take cognizance of that. I was aware and open to it. So this is moving on from just the family's view. Mm-hmm. This relates more to the community. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you saw the views of the community as impacting on the investigation?
Well, so it's exactly the same as we spoke about in terms of the family. So depending on, what the community perception was, and how we understood that, and whether one of the community leaders or member of the community was expressing a view that it was racism, so it would be then understanding why that was, take a statement in relation to that, and at the end of the day, even if they weren't prepared to provide a statement, you would be taking, as we spoke about already, be taking cognizance of that in terms of the investigation anyway. So, but you would factor that in as the fact that was a perception.
Right. And can I ask you to look at paragraph 96 now, please? I'm interested from the second line there. In terms of community tensions, community engagement, we need to appoint someone outside. We might appoint someone from safer communities and media. Depends on the incident. I can't remember who else. I'm interested in the idea of someone being appointed from the outside. Can you tell us who were you thinking of at that time?
So it's just it was engagement with liaison groups. So we would have advisors in terms of the NISAG, which is National Independent Strategic Advisory Group, which has a number of members of different communities who sit on that and who were in a position to provide us with whatever advice it is that we would require in terms of the incident that was unfolding or had unfolded. Thank you.
So this would be a partnership, people who are outside of Police Scotland, but who support Police Scotland?
Yeah, so I think I said yesterday we would look, so Nicola Shepherd was looking locally, and then we would have, from a Safer Communities, centrally positioned, looking nationally at exactly what was taking place. So, and then, so that's that's from a policing perspective, and then that engagement with the various advisors that we had round about the country that would be able to help us provide advice in relation to the kind of incident that we had ongoing.
And so it would be Nicola Shepherd who was she Bronze Commander in relation to this?
Yes.
And she would update the Gold Group in relation to issues on these matters?
That's right, yeah, yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you, we've heard evidence, and we may hear further evidence in the inquiry about searches that were carried out by police officers in relation to people connected to Mr. Bio, and including his legal representative, or the family's legal representative. Pat Campbell gave evidence when I asked him about this that he wouldn't have found any of that very helpful to his investigation. Are you aware of any reason why that may have been helpful to the investigation?
Sorry, can you please?
The searches done on databases in connection with people
I see.
connected to Mr. Bio, for example, Colette Bell,
Right.
who was his partner, and also his family's solicitor.
Searches in relation to the family solicitor.
Yeah.
I can't think why anybody would think that was beneficial.
Right, thank you. We were looking through the Gold Group meetings minutes yesterday. I think we had pretty much come to the end of the second Gold Group meeting. Let's just go back to that briefly to conclude it. It's PS 07268. And we started talking about this yesterday. This is the one at 1440, where Perk had arrived and were present at the Gold Group meeting. I wondered if we could look at page 2, item 3 on the agenda. And we did go through some of this yesterday. You'll see that bullet point 4, it says discussion regarding post-mortem is likely to be carried out tomorrow afternoon. So this is the meeting at 14:40 on the 3rd, and the post-mortem was due to take place the following day on the 4th. And a crime scene manager to be deployed for each loci, formal identification of deceased required. You've given us evidence about what your expectations were in relation to that. And then towards the bottom of that page, there's comment about a next of kin strategy. No formal ID, but ID has been done by a Facebook image initially. Do you have any recollection of a discussion at this Gold Group meeting about identification by a Facebook image?
No.
No. Do you see the final bullet point there? Flow to be briefed in relation to equality and diversity. Next of kin has been informed by DC Parker and DC Mitchell. We've heard evidence that those were the officers who delivered the death message.
Yes.
Do you remember what were your expectations in relation to the flow being briefed regarding equality and diversity?
Well, so my expectation would be that they would be asked if they were au fait with what the equality and diversity issues were, and if they weren't, then being briefed about that. But I don't know the detail of that, to be honest.
All right. Can I ask you to look at another set of minutes, PS 03139, and this, I think, is the third Gold Group meeting. Now, we've heard that there was a meeting at 1950 hours, and these minutes say 2015 hours. Do you remember what the time was?
No, I don't.
So again, you'll see that you were chairing the third Gold Group meeting. This is in the evening. We've heard by this stage Gary McEwen had gone to visit the next of kin. Can we move down to item 2, please? You see that there was an update given by Pat Campbell. A witness had come forward saying she'd videoed the aftermath of the incident at the locus on her mobile phone, and there was a task to seize that. And then if we look at item 3, investigative process, again you appear to have been given, if we move up the screen, you appear to be given an update in this regard. Now you'll see the last bullet point there in item 3 says CCTV for police vehicle that attended has not been working since March 2015, seized regardless. Do you remember that part of the discussion? We've heard evidence that the transit van, which was the first to arrive at the scene, had a means of recording, but
Yeah.
that hadn't been working.
Yeah.
Did you know did you have concerns? Did you know anything about that?
Well, I didn't, obviously before then I didn't know anything about that. Obviously it's brought up there, so, you know, the difficulty is that CCTV cameras, equipment, it will break down, but, you know, it's getting up and running as quickly as possible. So, and especially in vehicles such as this that are attending calls, you would want the, you know, from a public point of view, but also from a police safety point of view, you'd want the cameras to be working. So it sounds like it hasn't been working for 2 months, but, you know, I've no idea whether that was reported, where it was reported to, you know, and what was done in terms of actually getting either that system repaired or a new system put in. But you know, somebody at the local office there would know or will know exactly what happened.
Some witnesses have given evidence about CCTV and indicated that it would be a prioritisation of resources, but from what you're saying, would you consider CCTV recordings on a police vehicle such as this to be a higher priority than perhaps in other areas?
I mean, you take whatever's available to you. So if the police vehicle CCTV was available, then you would take it as you would take CCTV from elsewhere. I mean, it's, you know, it's independent in itself. It records what it records. I mean, it's and, you know, that would be a good starting point in terms of the investigation. But unfortunately, it's not been available.
So had it been available, that would have been of assistance to the investigation?
Yes, if I can give you an example, I spoke yesterday about the two police shootings, one in the Gorbals in Glasgow and one outside at Carfin railway station. And when the initial response went to the individual who was allegedly carrying a firearm, the helicopter was sent up to record the situation. Person was shot, and so the first thing to seize was the helicopter footage, which portrayed the whole scene, everything that had happened. And so that was a really good starting point in terms of understanding how the shooting had taken place. It would be the same with CCTV in a vehicle. You know, so if it records the whole incident and the scene, then that's a really good starting point in understanding exactly what happened.
Would you also think that things like a body-worn camera would assist in an investigation into what had happened?
Yes, it would. And, you know, for years we've, so I don't know the situation now. I've been out of the organisation for 7 years, but we looked on many occasions at having body-worn cameras, and we had pilots, I think, in Paisley and elsewhere. But as like many things, you need a lot of funding in terms of. So it's not just the camera itself; it's, you know, how you download it, how you support it, how you present it as evidence, and so. But I don't know where we are in terms of that now. But yes, of course, it would be helpful.
We certainly know that there were no body-worn cameras in 2015.
Yeah.
But that had that existed at the time, that would have been something you would have found helpful for the investigation.
Yes, it would be part of the investigation.
Can we look at item 5, which is further down the page of these minutes? Thank you. This relates to family concerns. And I'll read this out. I'm interested in your recollection of this discussion. So Gary McEwen discussed the brother-in-law of the deceased. He was part of an independent advisory group and had advised the initial attending officers he knew Mr McEwen and requested he attend and speak to him within 24 hours. Chief Superintendent and Chief Inspector Shepherd attended at the home address of the next of kin, highly charged environment, deceased partner Colette and extended family within. Family concerned that early contact the ad was purposely vague. They were unhappy. They had not been told anything about who contacted the police and ambulance. Chief Superintendent provided them with an understanding of events. Chief Superintendent discussed the role of the PERC and reassured them it would not be P Division officers investigating the incident. And the task there was identified as family crave reassurance and are asking about witnesses. They do not wish anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who is in London. Do you remember this part of the discussion at this third Gold Group meeting?
Yes. So in general terms, I do, yes.
Can you tell us what your recollection was about the discussion that took place in relation to Gary McEwen's visit to the family?
So I think that it's an update to Gold there to say that he'd been asked to attend and that he had, along with Nicola Shepherd, attended at the home address, which he obviously described as a highly charged environment. And then he obviously outlines there that he's discussed the role of the PERC and whatever else, just whatever's contained in that paragraph. I wouldn't expect that there was much more discussion about it than giving us a brief on exactly what happened.
What's your recollection of the words that are used in the second paragraph, that the family were concerned the early contact they had was purposely vague?
Yeah.
Do you remember what that was about?
Well, I think they felt that they hadn't been given enough information from the beginning.
And what was your view about that? Did you have any concerns about this?
Well, my view was, as I said before, was that we ought to be giving, the information that we have, and I can't remember exactly what the detail of, what they felt that they weren't being told, but, it's incumbent on us, giving the family all the information that they require.
I think prior to this, you gave evidence that in relation to Colette Bell, you thought she should have been told about
yes,
the death after coming into contact with the police, and there was no reason why she shouldn't have been given that information.
No, exactly.
In principle, is your view the same in relation to the next of kin?
It is, absolutely.
That they should have been given a full explanation and an honest explanation about what had happened?
Yes, absolutely.
And then it says here there'd be no P Division officers investigating the incident. Was that your understanding?
Well, as we discussed yesterday, obviously, P Division officers were on the ground investigating. I mean, we wouldn't really have any choice in the initial stages of the inquiry, but I assume that what he means from that is that at some stage it's going to become a PERC inquiry and P Division officers wouldn't be involved in that aspect of it.
So once PERC take over the investigation,
yeah,
the family were being told there would be no P Division officers?
Well,
do you think that's accurate?
I wouldn't like to say that's 100% accurate because, as I said before, the PERC don't have hundreds of resources. They've got a number of people, and I can't tell you the number now, but I probably knew it when I was in office. But so they have to work in a way that they'll have an SIO, and then they'll ask us to support them in terms of some of the investigation. So it may well be that when they've asked us to, I don't know what, see CCTV or carry out house-to-house inquiries or whatever, that P Division officers may well have been involved in that. So I don't know.
I'm conscious of the time, so as with yesterday, I think if I could stop you there, and I'll ask the chair if now might be an appropriate time to adjourn. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time.
Thank you. We'll stop for lunch and sit again at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you.